This is our translanguaging lesson plan for fourth grade. We decided to focus on science and specifically the internal and external structures of plants and animals, and we've integrated ELA with writing an argumentative piece. The time length of our lesson is over the course of 2 days, each lesson being 35 minutes long. And what we're doing is the first day we would introduce structures of animals, the second day being structures of plants. And during the first day, the teacher would introduce argumentation skills for students to utilize throughout the 2-day lesson, in which whenever they would answer comprehension questions, they would talk in full sentences, provide examples and details based on evidence from what they learned. The home languages in this classroom that we are looking at are English, Spanish, and Vietnamese. There are 0 students at the emerging English language learner level, 5 at the bridging level, and 2 at the expanding level. And we have 1 IEP for speech, 3 GATE identified students, and 1 504 plan for identified students on the autism spectrum.
So for the materials, we listed that students will be using their Chromebooks, and we will have an overhead projector as well as the science textbook and translation copies in Spanish and Vietnamese, as well as a vocabulary chart.
The big concept for our lesson is that students will be introduced to the inner and outer structures of certain plant and animal life, and then because of this they'll be able to argue how these internal and external functions support these plants and animals' daily life.
So for our standards, the science one we got from NGSS, from molecules to organisms, structures and processes. So this states construction argument that plants and animals have internal and external structure that function to support survival, growth, behavior, and reproduction. Then going down to our ELA standards, reading an informational text from key ideas and details. Refer to details and examples in the text when explaining what the text says explicitly and when drawing inferences from the full text. And our ELD standards, part 1, interacting in meaningful ways, states writing literary and informational text to present, describe, and explain ideas and information using appropriate technology.
And then as for our objectives for content, we say that students will learn about animals and plants and their specific internal and external structures, such as thorns, stems, colored petals, heart, stomach, lung, brain, skin, etc., and how each of these structures has specific functions within its associated system in plants and animals to aid in their survival. As for the language objective, we have that students will exhibit academic argumentation skills through verbally recalling evidence when talking with the teacher and other students, and then describing their point of view and supporting their argument with specific content vocabulary. So this will occur when they write an argumentation piece on their Chromebook at the end of the second lesson.
We have 2 translanguaging objectives. They are students will be exposed to critical vocabulary words in English, Spanish, and Vietnamese in the form of a language chart, which will feature columns of the 3 languages and utilize it throughout the lessons. Students will have the choice to write an argumentative piece in English, Spanish, or Vietnamese based on their knowledge of plant and animal structures they learn throughout the lessons.
And then for our bilingual vocabulary and biliteracy skills, these are the vocabulary words that we would feature on our vocabulary chart. So we would talk about thorn, stems, petals, heart, stomach, lungs, brain, and skin. And then this is what our chart would look like in terms of having the column in English, a column in Spanish, and a column in Vietnamese. And this would just aid in those English language learners having that translation right there visually for them to utilize. Moving down to our biliteracy skills. For listening, we have that students will listen to proper pronunciation of vocabulary words spoken in all 3 languages. So maybe a student that is an English language learner in Spanish can volunteer to pronunciate a certain vocabulary word in Spanish for the others, as well as Vietnamese. And then the second one for listening, we have that students will listen as their peers provide arguments of plant and animal structures. For speaking, we have students will volunteer to say the proper pronunciation of vocabulary words in the varying language, as I said. Students will be given the chance to read their typed argumentative piece on why structures of plants and animals are necessary to daily life in a language of their choosing. For reading, students will read vocabulary words from the chart in all languages. Students will read from the textbook in English, and particular students, the ELLs for Vietnamese and Spanish, they will be provided with a translated Spanish or Vietnamese version from the teacher. And for writing, students will have the chance to write their argument piece in a language of their choosing.
And then lastly, for our assessment, at the beginning of the lesson, the instructor would teach proper argumentative skills. So students will be asked throughout the lessons to provide responses using full sentences when arguing why certain structures are necessary to daily life as an informal assessment. So the teacher would ask, can someone raise their hand and tell me how you could describe why an eagle needs its lungs, for example? And then a student would respond, an eagle needs lungs to breathe in oxygen in order to survive. Without them, the eagle would not be able to breathe and would die. Just like us and other animals, eagles use their lungs constantly. So that's kind of an informal assessment the instructor would use throughout the lesson. For a self-assessment, students will be asked to make a first draft of their written responses in order to make any changes and self-correct any grammatical errors within their writing. They will also check if they have specific text evidence that backs up their argument, so they get a chance to double check that they included everything that they needed to before turning in a final draft, which will be the formal assessment. And the instructor will read every final draft of the students' written responses in order to check for understanding of the topic. The instructor will be able to see if they provided arguments for how and why internal and external structures of plants and animals are crucial to their survival and provide examples from the text to support their argument.